Hey there, YouTubers. My name's Steve, and welcome to my channel. Today I would like to discuss the Day of the Lord. In 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, Paul describes the rapture of the church, and then a few verses later he mentions the Day of the Lord in chapter 5. Those who advocate a pre-trib rapture believe that the rapture occurs prior to this Day of the Lord. However, this disconnect is entirely unscriptural, and cross-referencing shows that Paul was in fact connecting the church rapture to the Day of the Lord. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout," and that's a key word. "Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up." That's speaking of the church rapture. Into chapter 5 verse 2, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night." There are key parallels that can be found in the Old Testament book of Joel that shows an identical scenario. Joel is a prophetic writing solely dedicated to the coming day of the Lord. In Joel 2:11 it says, "And the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for the day of the Lord is great." And again Joel 3:15 and 16, "For the day of the Lord is near, the Lord also shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice." Okay, so it appears that Joel confirms that the Lord will utter his voice on the day of the Lord, just as Paul had described in his rapture passage. But why does this matter? The fact is, the day of the Lord is a strict post-tribulation event. If we go back to the book of Joel, it states in chapter 2 verse 11 that before the day of the Lord comes, the sun, moon, and stars will withdraw their shining. This means that the celestial lights are going to be turned off before the day of the Lord even comes. If we flip over to Matthew 24:29, Jesus tells us that these particular celestial occurrences won't even begin to take place till after the Great Tribulation. So in order for the day of the Lord to even begin, the sun, moon, and stars must withdraw their shining first. And in order for the sun, moon, and stars to withdraw their shining, the Great Tribulation must first play out in its entirety. This shows that the day of the Lord can only arrive at some point after the Great Tribulation. So like Paul, Joel tells us that the Lord will utter his voice on the day of the Lord. Paul merely attaches the church rapture to this particular day and identifies Jesus as the one who will descend with a shout at the rapture of the church. But Paul wasn't the only one to make this identification. The Apostle John in the book of Revelation describes the exact same celestial occurrences that Joel depicted in the Old Testament in regards to the day of the Lord. Revelation 6 says, "And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth. And the kings of the earth said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come." Like the Apostle Paul, the Apostle John makes an important clarification that was impossible to make in Joel's era because the Messiah had not yet been revealed. It is the day of the Lamb's wrath. The Lamb here is, of course, Jesus Christ. So once again, Jesus is scripturally identified as the Lord in the Old Testament term, Day of the Lord. This clarification is important because opponents have made attempts to separate the Old Testament Day of the Lord from the New Testament Day of Christ. But this is entirely unscriptural, since both Paul and John associated Jesus with the Old Testament Day of the Lord imagery. And right on cue, the Apostle John sees a great multitude of every nation, kindred, and tongue, dressed in white robes, having come out of where? You guessed it, the Great Tribulation, on the day of the Lord. What vast multitude of every nation and language and dressed in white robes could John be possibly talking about here? This is none other than the bride of Christ, the church. But how can this determination be made? Because Joel symbolically used the bridegroom and bride imagery in relation to the day of the Lord. Joel 2:16 reads, "Let the bridegroom go forth out of his chamber, and the bride out of her closet." Guess who else used this imagery in association with the day of the Lord? It was used in Matthew 25 by Jesus. Then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins, which took their lamps, and went forth to meet the bridegroom. The bride in Scripture, of course, is a representation of the present-day church. So could it be, with all of these cross-references, that Paul suddenly detours from the rest of Scripture and disconnects the church gathering from the day of the Lord? The answer is no. Paul writes about the day of the Lord in relation to the church rapture for a specific reason, because he knew that the two events would occur together. Since the day of the Lord is a post-trib event, it means the church rapture must take place after the Great Tribulation as well. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and also check out the links in the description below to read my book, Changed. You can read the entirety of my book absolutely free. Also, click on the link to my Facebook page for Changed, and like and share. Together, we will prepare the church for the coming days.